in the modern world and science today, we're struggling with the idea of, do these psychic things even exist? And so I knew from the esoteric traditions that it was assumed that these exist. So I went back all the way as far back to the first written account that I could find, where these powers were not only described, but methods of developing them were described.
I'd like to welcome to the show Dr. Dean Radin. How are you doing, Dr. Dean?
I'm fine, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm really excited to talk about your work that you've been doing for arguably now for the last 15, 20 years at this point?
Almost 40.
Almost 40 total. So you've been going at this for quite some time. So you're not new to this concept. I love your new book, Real Magic, because you're coming at it from a scientific perspective. But before we dive into that world, what made you decide to go down this road, this kind of esoteric, scientific, spiritual kind of road?
Because it's interesting.
It is that.
I mean, all you need to do is look at what proportion of the entertainment business is saturated with stories having to do with psychic phenomena, with mysticism, with superheroes, all of that. Clearly, it's of interest to a lot of people. So I'm no different than anybody else. The only difference is, being a scientist, I was trained to be able to use the tools of science to study virtually anything that's studyable. And as it turns out, psychic phenomena can be studied too. So I've managed to create a career where that's primarily what I've done.
Now, how can you discuss a little bit about how magic, with the concept of magic from a scientific perspective, which is always a dichotomy a little bit, because when you think of magic, you think of things that are not, that can't be real. That's generally what the public perception of magic is. But that's what's so fascinating, that you're coming at it from a scientific perspective. So I'd love you to discuss that.
If you go back far enough in history, nothing was understood. Everything was considered to be magical, supernatural, all that. Mm-hmm. So science is very good at figuring out things, including, I think now, some elements of magic. And the reason I say that is because when you look at what magical practice is all about, it falls into three categories. The first one is divination, the second is force of will, and the third is called theurgy. So divination, cast into scientific terms, or at least into other terms, is all about perceiving through space and time. That's what it's about. So are there scientific methods that have been used to study perception through space and time? Yeah. I mean, in modern vernacular, it's remote viewing. That's what that's all about. And of course, remote viewing is the euphemism of clairvoyance, which has been around for a very long time. So studies have been done. Studies strongly suggest that these phenomena are real. Not ancient magic, but they're still real. So force of will, you can think of from a magical perspective. We imagine ritual magic where lots of people are dressed in fancy costumes and dancing and doing other things. The point of all of that is to use your intention to change aspects of the world. That's what grimoires are all about, books of spells. They're about, I want this to happen. So it's an expression of intention to change the world. And then in the scientific world, we're looking at the relationship between mind and matter. From a research perspective, we're looking at psychokinetic effects. Does the mind influence aspects of the world directly? So up until already 70 or 80 years ago, it was thought that this was literally impossible. In fact, all of this magical stuff was impossible because it didn't seem to fit into our physical models of reality. But with the development of quantum mechanics in particular, and also general relativity, our notions of what we thought were absolutes, like space and time and energy and matter, it turns out that they're actually relationships. It's much more flexible in our understanding today of the physical world. And more importantly, the mind-matter relationship within modern physics is now acceptable to talk about. There are journals devoted to this within the mainstream. There are more and more people beginning to look at alternative philosophies that describe the nature of reality, which allows for mind and matter to directly interact. And then the third category is called theurgy, which is a Greek term which roughly means God work, and it refers to spirits. So the other aspect of doing ritual magic is to evoke spirits or to communicate with them or somehow get them to do something on your behalf, if you're lucky. If you're not so lucky, then you have a problem. So in the modern world, what we see then, what we can test, are the whole range of evidence for survival after bodily death. What we can bring into the laboratory is rather limited among those anecdotes. We can study things like near-death experience in the lab, but the ones that I have been involved in is mediumship. So psychics who specialize in speaking to spirits. So all of these magical practices can be recast into terms that are compatible with what we can do today from a scientific perspective. And that's what I do.
So you mentioned remote viewing. I mean, there's been so much literature and obviously a few movies dedicated to government programs about remote viewing, and it's been proven it is a real thing as far as what the government thought it's a real thing, and I'm not sure if they continue to think it's a real thing, but they did kind of like open up a special department that just focused on remote viewing, and they did this and please correct me, World War II, or I know when we were in the Cold War, things like that, or even maybe farther back, I'm not sure, but is that true?
Yeah, it is true. The program you're probably referring to, which is most well known, was codenamed Stargate. So that was a classified program. It went from 1972 to 1995, and it was not known during then, at least not known publicly. In 95, it became declassified, and some years later, almost all of the documentation was released through a Freedom of Information Act from the CIA. There's now 4 big, fat volumes, which is a accumulation of almost all of the research and a whole bunch of the behind-the-scenes work with the government, like memos and who was involved and all that sort of stuff. Some of it is still not public because it involves identifying people and methods. So those will probably always remain classified, but the vast majority of it is now in the public domain.
And the one thing I found interesting in looking through your work is that many of the founding fathers of science were really interested in esoteric ideas and a lot of the concepts that you talk about.
Yeah, and increasingly so today. But again, using different language. So academics are, except for those who are specializing in the history of the origins of science and religion and so on, they're studying the esoterica. But most scientists stay away from that word because it sounds spooky. Scientists are not supposed to study spooky stuff. So we recast it into terms which are more comfortable in the academic world, which is primarily about metaphysics. And I'm not talking about metaphysics in the popular sense, but in the philosophical sense. It's a word used in philosophy which refers to what is the ultimate nature of reality. So we use fancy terms like ontology and epistemology and all of those kinds of terms. And what philosophy is very good at, which many scientists don't pay much attention to, is what are the underlying assumptions that we use when we study a topic. So in science, the underlying assumption is called the doctrine of materialism. And that the assumption is that everything, all of reality, including our own conscious awareness and everything else, is ultimately made out of matter and energy. Like that's all there is. In which, from that perspective, we live in a nihilistic universe, another philosophical term, which means that we don't see in the physical world things like meaning or purpose. right? We think more like physics. We're measuring stuff, and there doesn't seem to be any meaning in a rock or meaning in an electron or anything like that. So the nihilism notion is that there's no meaning or purpose in the physical world, including in you. You may think you have some meaning and purpose, but ultimately you die. That's the end of it, end of the game. Well, that's based on a set of assumptions, and the assumptions have been extremely effective in terms of what science has been able to learn about the nature of reality. But more and more scientists and academics are coming to view, though, is that there's something very peculiar about our sense of awareness, our internal sense of having an experience. Well, this is all about consciousness and where does it come from and what can it do and all of that. When you look at that in detail and you see more and more trends going in this direction, the academic world is coming around to the idea that there's something different about consciousness. And when you then turn to philosophers and say, well, what do you think about this? It turns out there's a very long history about this, going back to Plato and even before, where the notion of all of the esoteric traditions are that consciousness came first, then the physical world. So this is called idealism. It's a philosophical stance about assumption. So what happened first? Did our awareness come first, or did matter come first? Idealism says that consciousness comes first. So from that set of assumptions, it turns out that things psychic, things mystical, things magical, all of that is very easy to understand. That was the underlying assumptions within the magical traditions, among other things. It also turns out that almost all of the founders of quantum mechanics, physicists, were idealists. You can see their writings, all of them basically wrote that consciousness is fundamental. It comes before anything else. And it's not hard to think about why this comes about, because when you think about what it is that you know, the only thing that you know and the only thing you will ever know is what comes through your awareness. By definition, if you're not aware of it, it's not part of you. But that extends even to our inferences about the nature of reality. So I make a measurement of something. Well, how do I know what it is? Well, it has to become aware. I need to be aware of the measurement. So was the measurement independent of me, or is it part of me? Did I create it? These are the kinds of questions that are at the leading edge right now in science. And you don't need to search too far in Google to find experiments that are testing whether or not a reality is either literally created out of our consciousness or is modulated in some way through consciousness. So what used to be very, very spooky stuff is in the past 30 years or so becoming a respectable topic even in the academic world, which tends to be very conservative about these sorts of things.
So science is catching up to what philosophers and ancient texts have been talking about for 4,000 or 5,000 years.
In one sentence, yes.
In one word, yes. So, from my understanding of quantum physics and quantum mechanics, and again, my rudimentary understanding of it, is that if you go as far down as you can with a microscope, we see nothing now. It's energy, essentially, that we are all made of energy. There is no solid matter. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah.
So if that's the case, then what is the force that is shaping the things around us? So why is a rock, if it's just energy, what created the shape of the rock? What created the bookshelf behind you? What created the shirt that you're wearing? What created you, your glasses? What is that force that has put all this energy together? And I know it's an easy question, I know, but but in your opinion, what do you think?
Well, the truth is we don't know. There's a lot of very interesting work having to do with self-organizing systems. It's all about in the domain of complex systems and chaos theory and other theories that say that if you have a big bunch of energy, it eventually coalesces into matter, it will self-organize. And it organizes into larger and larger structures. Things emerge out of it. In fact, this is true throughout science, that you assume that you have a pyramid shape, which is our rough description of reality. So if you start with standard physics, at the bottom of that pyramid is energy and matter, but things emerge out of that. Like, things are made up out of electrons, and they get together and they form molecules and they form larger and larger structures. Eventually it turns into what we call chemistry. And eventually that also then turns into biology, and that turns into physiology, and that turns into psychology, and so on. So that's the way that we can think of how things are made. From what we're talking about from an esoteric point of view is exactly the same structure, this hierarchical structure, except that at the bottom is consciousness. It doesn't magically pop up somehow in the brain, but it was there from the very beginning. So from that perspective of consciousness at the bottom, somehow the physical world emerges out of that. So consciousness in this sense is some kind of a strange substance. I'll put that word in quotes. Some primordial something that is part of the fabric of reality, and from that things emerge. So about the closest that we have today for a physical substrate would be something like the 0-point energy.
Okay. So if consciousness is what is consciousness what drives us, as far as we're obviously a vehicle, a car, let's say. Someone's driving this car. That's awareness, that's consciousness. Is there something behind the driver? Because if someone's asking the question in your mind, who's asking the question if it's not you? I know we're starting to get into some deep waters here, but I'd love to hear what you think of that.
Yeah, is there a homunculus, a little tiny man living in your head?
Like in Men in Black.
Yeah, is it making your body move? Well, we haven't found the little man.
We've looked.
It appears as though, like virtually all organisms, our prime directive is to survive.
Right.
Just from an evolutionary point of view, we were created. We want to survive as long as we can. All of those things. So, who's driving the boat? But it's ourselves. It's our whole nervous system, our brain, our surroundings, which modulate what we think we want to do. All of it is involved in the way that people behave. So it's not just even one organism. It's the relationship between this organism and the rest of the world that determines how it is that I have a sense of what I want and what I do, combined with things like, well, physiologically, I need food. Well, that's a driver. So as part of the process of remaining as in a homeostatic state as best as I can for 80 years or however long, much of that is going to be driven by physiological needs, some of it by genetic inheritance, and a lot of it by how society tells me how I should behave.
Now, with that example you gave, that we are, a being, let's say, but everything inside of us, we're not just a single matter. There's millions upon, if not billions, of organisms and things and systems working together to keep this system moving, to keep this being moving. Same could go with the planet. Same could go with ecosystems. All of that. And I find it so interesting that one of the main reasons we as a species has been able to survive and go to the top of the food chain is because of our ability to cooperate and to work with each other. Because without cooperations, there were so many other animals that were much stronger, much faster, could see better than we, could hear better than we, could smell better than we are. But our ability to cooperate with each other is what was able to do it. And yet, in today's world, we seem to be so fragmented, and they think, and we have this I mentality, or this kind of me mentality, where the world is not connected. People think we're separate, but from a scientific perspective, we are all interconnected. We are all interdependent. Is that a fair statement?
Sure. No, there's no doubt of that. I mean, you can go off in the woods and live by yourself. Mm-hmm. There are people who want to do that. But that's not generally how we are social creatures. I mean, we come out of a long evolution of tribes. And so one of the things you're talking about then is that tribalism is raising its head. Tribalism is useful for the individual because it helps your survival.
Right.
But if you have too many tribes and they have different ideas about the way things work, it rips apart the fabric of society, and that limits what any individual can do. So why does that happen? I mean, what is new now that we didn't see in the past? And I think the real answer is nothing is new. We've always been tribal. We get together at times when we need to get together, like somebody's attacking our country and suddenly everybody's like one mind of what we're going to do. But I think that's the exception rather than the rule. The other thing that is happening is because the climate is changing and because we know that we are interconnected with the climate, that many previous studies have shown that even things like there's more violence in the summer than there is in the winter. Because as the temperature goes up, we get agitated. So climate change is agitating the whole population, and people who are on the edge and don't have very good impulse control, they're striking out with violence. So car accidents are way up and murders are way up, all kinds of things related to violence, which fortunately doesn't affect most people, but you only need a small percentage of the population which are on the edge and can get pushed. So you have temperature changes, weather changes, pandemics, of course, and then eventually, and we're beginning to see this already, migration. People are moving away from places that they either is because their own country is falling apart or because the climate is changing. Whenever you have, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of people who are forced to go somewhere else, the people where they're going to don't like it very much. And that's creating even more conflict. So we're in for an interesting ride over the next 10 years or so.
Yeah, and it's interesting even within our country, the migration. There's a great migration going on from all the big cities are being spread out to. And I just moved from Los Angeles to Austin, and so many people are moving to Austin, Nashville, North Carolina, Florida. They're just starting to spread out, and I haven't ever seen anything because most of my life is like you got to go to the big city. That's where everything is. But now with technology and also just people are going, you know what? I don't know if I want to do 2 hours of traffic every day. And I don't want to spend $5,000 for a closet in New York City. Why am I? And the pandemic, I think, did a little bit of a shakeup and made people reevaluate their perceptions in life. Yeah,
a big shakeup. Yeah, and so another example, though, of how we are interconnected in the society and our health and all of that. It's all interconnected. You can't have a big change in one place without changing everything. So and this is going to continue too. So if we're lucky, COVID will turn into something like the flu, and we could have vaccines or something, but it's not going to go away. Actually, it's going to get worse.
Yeah, I don't think so either. And I think that I agree with you that it probably will eventually live with this. This is never going to go away. This is not going to be an eradicated thing because it's kind of like a flu. And flu's not going away, cold's not going away. But it's also fascinating because if one country's like, all right, we're vaccinated, we don't have to worry about anybody else. But if another country has an outbreak and one or two come over, as we just saw with Omicron, there was a complete rise in cases that was insane. And now we have another variant, and like all of this stuff is happening. I keep, from a scientific perspective, I'd just like to hear your opinion on why you think that. There's obviously a change going on. In my lifetime, I've never seen anything like this. The whole world is feeling it, which is also something that generally doesn't happen. I don't think has ever happened in the way that this pandemic and everything that's going on. You can just sense that the world is feeling it. It's not one country or a group of countries or Europe or Africa. Everyone's feeling this at the same time. There seems to be a great shift. There's something's happening. From your perspective, what do you think that is, and how do you think it's going to affect us in the future?
Well, one way to look at it is that the evolution of the first microbe on the Earth to today, now project out another large amount of time, we go from an organism to the noosphere, which is a term that Teilhard de Chardin and others have talked about, which is a conscious planet. That we're momentarily in a form where we have individual bodies and we know we're interconnected, but we don't pay much attention to it except when the supply line goes bad, and then we all worry about it.
You want toilet paper?
Yeah, and so from a evolution of the first microbe on the earth to today, and now project out another large amount of time, we go from an organism to the noosphere, which is a term that Teilhard de Chardin and others have talked about, which is a conscious planet. That we're momentarily in a form where we have individual bodies and we know we're interconnected, but we don't pay much attention to it except when the supply line goes bad, and then we all worry about it.
You want toilet paper?
Yeah, and so from a longer term perspective, I think a case can be made that we're moving towards a global society. For reasons that you said, it's the media and instantaneous connections and all of that. Whenever you have a system that is very complex and there's more and more feedback systems within it and more interconnection, it becomes its own organism. It's a thing, right? So like the Terminator series of movies is the Skynet becomes a thing. Like it gains consciousness,
self-aware, yeah.
Well, so the internet today is moving in that direction. You add on the new forms of AI that are being created and the interconnectivity at a computer level, combined with all of the humans involved in that process as well, a case can be made, and this is of course what people are calling the singularity. It's related to the singularity in the sense that the moment that some fancy system that is non-human gains awareness, the game for us is over, unless we turn out to be important in some way for its livelihood, whatever that may be. But we become a planetary creature. We become Gaia. So what's interesting is that maybe we're already Gaia. Maybe Gaia is dreaming at this point, not fully awake. Because if you think about, you go in your brain and you look at one cell. Well, the cell thinks it's a separate thing. It's physically a separate thing, but it has a huge number of connections going out to other neurons. You ask that individual neuron, why do you do the things that you do? Well, it can give you reasons, just like I gave you reasons before. It has no idea that it is part of 100 billion other neurons and 1 trillion interconnections that is creating this new organism, which I call me. Well, the same, I think, would be true here, that the planet can become actually aware as an independent entity, and we may or may not even be aware of it. I think some people would be aware of it, and maybe that is what we're feeling, that there's something bigger than us. It's like the whole planet has become alive. So my first book that I wrote already over 20 years ago is called The Conscious Universe. Because you can play this game and say, well, we can start with microbes, but you can expand it out to the entire universe pretty quickly, because there are all kinds of interconnections going on between planets, between
solar systems,
elements of the galaxy, and so on. It just goes all the way out. So maybe the entire universe at some point either is already or at some point becomes conscious.
It's very easy questions, Doc. It's very easy stuff that we're talking about. Very light conversations. Now, to go back a little bit to the magic aspect of your book, Real Magic, and some of your prior works, I think it was Supernatural was the other book that you wrote in regards to Supernormal. Excuse me. Thank you. You discuss the yogic superpowers. You study the Eastern yogi superpowers. I mean, I've studied a lot of ancient Indian texts. Yogananda, and so many others, religious texts, and they talk about these yogic superpowers where it's levitating and being in two places at the same time and walking through material things, all these kind of things that seem very superhero-esque. But can you discuss your exploration of those kind of yogic powers and what you discovered?
Well, it's part of Supernormal is a book that's looking at Eastern esoteric traditions. And my most recent book, which is there, Real Magic, is looking at it from the Western perspective. If you go back far enough in history, there's no difference between East and West. So it's sort of a convenience way of thinking about these things. From the Eastern perspective, yoga has been around for a long time. And one of the first written books that wrote down what had been an oral tradition at that point was the Yoga Sutras by Patanjali. So the third of 4 little books that make up the Yoga Sutras is all about the development of special powers, siddhis, they would call it. So the reason why it caught my attention is that in the modern world and science today, we're struggling with the idea of, do these psychic things even exist? And so I knew from the esoteric traditions that it was assumed that these exist. So I went back all the way as far back to the first written account that I could find, where these powers were not only described, but methods of developing them were described. Well, that's the Yoga Sutras. So you look at the third book, and it basically goes through about 20, 25 different kinds of powers that develop as a result of yogic practice, by which they primarily meant not the calisthenics that are thought of as yoga today, but the meditation part of it, which was the core. So the idea was, like a lot of the older philosophies, the assumption was that consciousness is fundamental. You learn how to dive deep within your own consciousness. And from that perspective, if you do certain kinds of practices, you want telepathy, you can have telepathy. You want precognition, you could have precognition. Some of the things that they talk about, like invisibility and super strength and so on, we don't generally see that sort of thing. But it's also true that even those who practiced those kinds of things, like who get into these deep states called samadhi, they couldn't do it either. So these superpowers apparently may have been real, but they were very, very rare, even among people who were practicing their whole life. What is not so rare is, when you look at this spectrum of 25 or so different sorts of powers, the very first one is called perception of past, present, and future. Today we would call that somewhere between clairvoyance and precognition. Almost everybody has some of that. Some people are better than others, but it's sort of across the board. And interestingly, that's the first siddhi that is thought to arise as a result of dedicated meditation practice. And we did a survey at one point asking both experienced and new meditators, what sort of experiences have you had as a result of doing your meditation practice? Well, perception of past, present, and future. One of the ways that manifests is through things like synchronicities. So we asked, you're finding you ever have more synchronicities as a result of meditative practice? Yeah, 75% of people who start meditating say, yeah, I'm noticing that more. It's happening more. So this tells us, combined with the laboratory studies showing that these phenomena are real, it strongly suggests that these effects have been around basically as long as humans have been around, and probably are not limited to humans. It's simply a part of the fabric of reality, is interconnected across space and time, which made no sense before the idea of quantum entanglement. But now we know that is the real thing. So somehow we can experience that directly. That's what the suggestion is at this point.
And you said not just human. I mean, if you could just look at animals. Animals know when there's an earthquake. Animals know when there's a hurricane coming. They don't have Weather Channel, but yet they're like, oh, something's coming. I'm out of here. And right. You can literally see it, and it's everywhere. In the animal kingdom, they can see things or feel things before we do. Even dogs, even if you're just your dog, will be able to sense things. Not just the intruder, but sense things that we we just don't sense many times.
Yeah. But of course, keep it also in mind that most animals have much better senses than we do, much more sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
So in the case of an approaching tsunami or an earthquake, they may be able to hear it or feel it. I mean, directly, not with any kind of psychic thing, but their sensory system is much better. But experiments have also been done, like Rupert Sheldrake did experiments with dogs who changed their behavior when their owners decided to come home. Well, they're not going to smell that because the owner might be 20 miles away.
Right. We have seen
More sensitive.
things that we just don't sense many times.
Yeah. But of course, keep it also in mind that most animals have much better senses than we do, much more sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
So in the case of an approaching tsunami or an earthquake, they may be able to hear it or feel it. I mean, directly, not with any kind of psychic thing, but their sensory system is much better. But experiments have also been done, like Rupert Sheldrake did experiments with dogs who changed their behavior when their owners decided to come home. Well, they're not going to smell that because the owner might be 20 miles away.
Right. I've seen those studies. Like they put the video in the second the owner leaves the office, he comes to the door because he knows he's on his way.
Yeah.
How is that even a thing?
Well, it's the same question for how do humans know how to do that? So the best that we can do at this point is say, well, at least it's compatible with what we know about the physical world. There are interconnections, so we can make up stories at this point, and they're only stories, theories. And my colleagues and I around the world are looking at these theories and saying, can we figure out ways of testing? Make up an idea of how do we think that's working that can be tested and then falsified. Because just, you can test something and see that it's real, but that's not going to tell you very much. You need to know, is this theory or that theory correct or more correct? Well, there has to be a way to discriminate between the two. That's most of what we do today. We're doing studies that are involved in the process of these kinds of phenomena, and we're not that interested anymore in whether they exist, because those of us who have studied the evidence, it's very clear that the phenomena exist.
Now, you discuss meditation as in the yogic practices, and also meditation in general is one of the most scientifically studied things now for the last 30 or 40 years. There's just so many different studies on the benefits, the health benefits, what happens in meditation. What do you think happens inside of meditation? Because, I've been meditating for probably 5 years now, 5 or 6 years. I can meditate anywhere between an hour to 3 hours at a time. I think my record is 4.5 hours. There are obviously health benefits because my blood work shows it. My nutritionist is like, you meditate, don't you? I'm like, because there's no reason why these markers should be as low as they are and so on. But there are other things that you feel when you're meditating. It almost feels blissful when you're inside of a meditation. First of all, do you meditate? And secondly, what do you think happens from a scientific perspective when we meditate that starts to unlock possibly these things that you've been studying?
Yeah, I do meditate, not regularly. I go through periods where I'll be very disciplined for a year or two, then I'll drop it for a while, and then I'll start up again. So exactly why that happens, I don't know why I start and stop, but I first learned how to meditate in 1970 because TM was pretty strong on campuses. Maybe they still are, but anyway, that's the first one that I learned. And so I did that, and I've done many different styles over the years. And now when I get back to doing meditation, it's usually Vipassana. It's the thing that works best for me. So how does it work? Well, there are theories about what's going on, and certainly physiologically we calm down significantly. I think your interesting question, though, is at very deep levels of meditation, why do we sense it as bliss?
Right. Because I walk out of it. I walk out of it like in this almost a haze, a blissful haze, where everything just, I'm almost kind of still, as I'm walking, I'm still kind of waking up from it. It's almost the grogginess you feel when you wake up or you're woken up in the middle of the night. When you come out of a deep meditation, there is this, and the word bliss is the only word that I can explain it, because it's not happy. I'm not sad, but I'm not happy. It's bliss. And then it'll start to wear down as maybe 5 or 10 minutes walk down. But I'll walk back and my daughters will come up to me like, they'll just sense like, you were just meditating, weren't you? I didn't say a word, but they could even sense that there's something different about my energy, if you will. So yeah, bliss is what I came up with it for my practice, at least.
Yeah, I don't know why that happens. I mean, it clearly does happen in the literature, and as from your own experience, these kinds of states do happen, where you get into some state that seems to transcend the limitations of the body, and for reasons that the perception, the way that we describe the state that we go into is this. In my case, for example, a infusion of yellowish light. Like a yellowish light that happens, and it feels really, really, really good. Well, so that's the bliss state. I don't know why that happens. I'm not sure that anybody knows why that happens, unless at these very deep states in samadhi generally, that you're contacting something else about the nature of reality. Like normally we're embedded in some sort of ocean of consciousness or fabric of reality, but our conscious daily everyday awareness keeps us pretty far away from that, which actually quite far away, all the way to the point where normal waking awareness doesn't pay any attention to that at all. We're consumed with things we have to do, or things like talking and that sort of thing. But in these other deep states, it's almost as though you're connecting back with the essence of what you really are. And the you here is a little bit in quotes, because, is there a self in there? What is that? Is it just pure awareness? Whatever that is, that pure awareness, when we later describe what it's like, or even while you're meditating, it feels very pleasant. Well, so if you put on your neuroscience hat and you'd say, well, feeling pleasant is associated with all kinds of things. It's neurochemicals, and there's portions of the brain that light up and all of that. It's like your amygdala is all very happy at the moment. Well, maybe that's the way that it's reflecting within the nervous system, that the nervous system gets to a state of quiescence where everything can just relax in a way that it normally can't, even during dreaming. And so maybe it's a little bit like going into deep sleep, but you haven't lost your awareness. And in deep sleep, we're in some kind of regeneration mode. And so if you can go into that state consciously, maybe that would feel blissful. It's like, plugging in and recharging your battery.
Yeah, and I always find after a good meditation, I am recharged. And I do have the battery has kind of been recharged a bunch. It's not the same as sleeping, but it can be, and especially when you start listening to some of these yogis, yogic masters who talk about like, I only meditate for 2-3 hours and I don't need to sleep for 3 or 4 days, and I'm perfectly fine. They're obviously at a different level of on the path than you or I are, but I just find it so interesting that it's such a simple thing, meditation. I mean, you sit quietly and try to clear your mind, or allow the mind to chatter, to calm to a place where you can just be. And I think you're right. I think you're kind of like, if you're at the top level of the ocean during normal awakened state, in a meditative state, you're down at the Mariana Trench, all the way down there with those funky looking fish. And you get to go down there to a place that you normally can't access, not even inside a sleeping state. So but yet it gives you so many physical benefits, mental benefits, psychological benefits. It's so powerful. And now, before, I mean, if you were learning TM in the 70s, in the 70s, if you were meditating, you're a whack job. You're completely out there. You're a hippie. You're gone. But now there's apps. Now CEOs are like, yeah, I meditate every day. It's part of my hustle. So it's amazing too how the awareness of meditation has become completely mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
Completely mainstream.
Yeah, that's part of what I talk about in my book, Supernormal.
Mm-hmm.
It's the normalization of something that used to be considered super or wacky, as you said.
Right.
And so I take that as a good sign. This is part of the pendulum that keeps swinging back and forth on what does society regard as normal versus not normal. Well, the paranormal includes a huge mishmash of different kinds of weird stuff. Psychic phenomena, unfortunately, is considered part of the paranormal. It shouldn't be, because it is actually amenable to science, and we know a lot more about that than we do about things which are regarded as the paranormal, like Bigfoot, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
But it falls into that class. So I see that part of the work that I'm doing and my colleagues do is normalizing at least one aspect of the paranormal. And also, as I said before, if you go back far enough in history, everything was paranormal. Everything was magic. We didn't have good ideas about anything. Well, we slowly normalize and better understand the aspects of reality. That's what science is really good at.
So it's always interesting is no matter at what point in time you're at, man thinks that they know everything. So, when the sun was a god, it was a god. When the earth was flat, it was flat. And it just, obviously the markers are changing. The chains keep moving, if you will, for a football metaphor. The chains keep moving, the markers keep moving. So what was crazy in the 70s is now completely acceptable and actually encouraged. Things that, I remember reading Autobiography of a Yogi, and when Yogananda brought over meditation and yoga from the East in the 20s, can you imagine him walking around as a yogi when most people had never even seen an Indian before, let alone a yoga master? So at that point, he was, it was completely out there. There was riots. People were trying to push him out of cities and things. Where today, where the things that he was talking about are completely normalized now. So things that are today taboo or wacky or these kind of ideas, some of the things that you talk about in 100 years, they're going to be like, well, they were just barbaric back in 2022.
Yeah. But that's the entire history of our civilization, really, and especially within science. Like scientists tend to be very conservative and naturally skeptical, as I am. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the history of Nobel laureates, just as one example, you find a lot of them came up with some brilliant idea, and occasionally they were recognized very quickly for their advancement. But there's many, many cases where people were basically laughed at for 20, 30 years until finally there was enough evidence to say, oh, okay, they were right after all. Okay, here's a prize. Here's a prize because you persisted in making us think about other things. But the initial reaction is, oh, that's crazy. That's a crazy thing.
Well, Galileo was obviously a very famous example of that.
Yeah. It's a long history of such things.
And there is kind of like there's a concept called scientific blinders that you talk about. Yeah. Is that basically what you're describing? There's just very conservative.
Yeah, we fall in love with our ideas, and then it's really, really difficult to change them.
Because science shouldn't be fluid. It shouldn't be evolving at all times. It should be like, oh, well, we figured 1 + 1 = 2. There can never be 1 + 1 = apple.
Yeah. Well, humans are, this is a human thing, really. It's
right.
Science and the academic worlds are supposed to be, have complete freedom in terms of what you study. But that's a fiction. That has never been the case. Right. Anytime you have humans get together and devise some kind of enterprise, there are taboos, things you don't talk about openly, and there are constraints in terms of the way that money is used generally, or support of any type, like what are we going to support? Well, if you're proposing something that is going to push the status quo too much, you're not allowed to do that. You will find very quickly that you're either shunned, or if you're in the academic world, you don't get tenure, so you have to leave it. There's a lot of pressure to maintain the status quo. And when the status quo is pushing against things that have a huge economic interest, like in medicine, like in energy, and so on, you have to be very, very careful how you tread. So within the domain of psychic phenomena, we're not, at this point anyway, we're not pushing the status quo too much, because most people have these experiences, whether they want to admit it or not. And we can see from our entertainment that people enjoy it. So it's not pushing too much. But if we get to the stage where, for example, one of the projects we're working on is the genetics of psychic ability. And we think from a small scale study that we did, and also from an enormous amount of folklore across cultures, that some people are talented and that talent runs in families. Just like every other talent that we know, a component.
Yeah.
If we continue to do these studies and we find that there are genetic or epigenetic reasons for the talent, it will mean that we'll be able to identify people who have talent through their DNA, which some people find is great, and others, they freak out as a result.
Yeah.
We probably also can find ways of enhancing the ability. You can take a, quote, normal person and turn them into a super psychic by doing a genetic modification. And you can do the flip side too. You can turn off these capabilities, which you think about, where would this push society to the point where the status quo is saying, oh no, you don't? Imagine we create a pill, you take the pill and you become incredibly good at telepathy. Well, the very first thing that's going to happen is that there will be no secrets. You cannot have a government. You cannot have business. You can't have any international relationships if there are no secrets.
Right.
So that would strongly push against the way civilization works now on this planet. And there would be a very, very strong suppression of any knowledge of that type. I mean, if tomorrow we came out with something, it would probably be classified so far in the deep black that we'd never be able to talk about it.
I mean, it would be an episode of the X-Files that would talk about it.
Push against the way civilization works now on this planet. And there would be a very, very strong suppression of any knowledge of that type. I mean, if tomorrow we came out with something, it would probably be classified so far in the deep black that we'd never be able to talk about it.
I mean, it would be an episode of the X-Files that would talk about it, maybe.
Yeah, you could talk about it as stories, but not as real.
Correct.
Because, yeah.
No, it's the concept of the placebo effect. That still, like, the medical profession doesn't even like to talk about the placebo effect. I even read an interview where a doctor's like, oh, that placebo effect is messing up my results. Well, there's obviously something there. So even it took years to figure out that the mind has some sort of effect on your healing. What you think and what you believe is extremely powerful in the process of healing. That has been scientifically proven, but nobody likes to talk about that because there's no money in you thinking you can feel yourself better.
That's right. Yep. Unfortunately, pharmaceuticals are actually, you have to do a placebo-controlled trial. So you're able to show that, yeah, you can get 5% over placebo with this particular drug, which in some cases is very valuable, right? I mean, especially in things like pain control and so on. Sometimes you could struggle internally to prevent the pain and you just can't.
Sure, of course.
So in which case, yeah, so pharmaceuticals are quite good. Can in the future we figure out a way of doing purely through mind? I think maybe we can, right? Once we understand better about consciousness and its relationship to the body and all that stuff, as an engine, we are amazingly good at creating all of the chemicals that we need Like you want to create an opioid internally, an endogenous one, we could do that.
You can.
Yeah.
It's being able to turn it on and off is the question.
Yes.
And would you
control?
Yeah, exactly. And also, can you, like, if you wanted to feel ecstasy at all times, would we just have a bunch of people just like high constantly because they keep releasing that within themselves?
Some of them, yes. Some people will get addicted to it in the same way that they get addicted to any kind of drug.
It's really interesting your talk in regards to genetics inside of psychic abilities or psi abilities, because if you start looking at the literature, you've got grandma who's a medium or a psychic, and that gets passed on to the granddaughter, and then she discovers that she has some abilities as well. And whether you believe it or not, it doesn't matter. But I never thought about the genetic capabilities of psychic abilities, which is really an interesting concept that you're actually studying that. And so you're taking people who are psychic or have some sort of psychic power that you can test, and then seeing what their genetic makeup is and seeing what's a common denominator across. It's basically your experiment.
Yeah, we find it's called a case control study. You find cases that have the characteristics that you're interested in. You find controls that don't. You run their entire genome, and there's lots of bioinformatics methods to analyze differences between the two, and we found something. So the world today of the tools available for genetic understanding are really, really good and only getting better, like practically every day. So to just give you one example, we know today that there's a difference between different kinds of intelligence that has a genetic basis. So the two types, one is called crystalline intelligence and the other is fluid intelligence. So that's sort of what you would imagine they are. So crystalline intelligence is extremely good at analytical stuff, mathematics and so on. And fluid intelligence is more like being highly creative. Mm-hmm. There are constellations of hundreds of genes which discriminate between those two kinds of intelligence. So, we're not talking about one gene is making this happen. We're talking about the interaction of lots and lots of genes. So in our study for psychic phenomena, we found one variant in the intron sequence. So you look at if you sequence the whole genome, it's over 1 billion different genes and interactions. The intron sequence is most of what the genome is. It's about 95% of the genome. And it used to be called junk DNA because nobody knew what it did. So the two parts then are the exome and the intron. The exome is the part of the DNA that creates proteins, that makes us. We're made out of proteins. Well, what is the other 95% doing? The other 95% is essentially an epigenetic switch. It tells the genes how to express. So if you have roughly, I forget exactly, 20 to 30,000 genes that create proteins, but they can do all kinds of interesting things, but they need to be told what to do. Well, that's what the intron sequence does, this epigenetic part. That's where we found a difference. So I actually strongly suspect that it's not just the intron sequence. It's not an epigenetic effect. There are actual combinations of the genes that will also turn out to be important in terms of what is grandma passing down that makes the granddaughter a medium. Well, there are methods that look at the combinations of hundreds of thousands of genes at the same time to see what's interacting with what. So those methods are available. It's kind of expensive still to do that. So again, like anything else, all you need is money and some people with clever machinery and knowing what they can do. We could figure this out. And interestingly, I would say that maybe 75% of the people I talk to about this project think this is fabulous. You could learn all kinds of interesting things. And then about 25% are just totally freaked about it because they become so paranoid about how their private information is being used that they don't like the idea of somebody getting their DNA from something and figuring out like everything about you. Well, of course, it isn't everything, but it's a lot. we're learning more and more about the way that people are based on their physiological structure and their genetic structure. So some of the best personality tests, about half of the personality test is looking at what is your biological state like? What are you made up of? What are your natural inclinations? Because that strongly drives your personality. And so a personality test, which is asking questions like, what do you prefer? And, what ways of thinking and all that, they're valuable, but you get much more information if you get at the basic physiological structure of the person, because that's a very strong driver of what you end up being. And that's why people are afraid of the genetics, because that even tells you more.
So you're starting to find that there is a creative sequence and a more analytical sequence. So in other words, the different states, you were saying the flowing, I forgot what the term you used. Fluid, excuse me. Yeah,
fluid intelligence.
Fluid intelligence. So fluid intelligence would be more of a creative, an artist, a musician, a filmmaker, a writer, an artist of some sort. And then the other intelligence would be much more analytical, academic.
Crystalline intelligence. You can imagine crystal.
Right, exactly. So one's an accountant and one's a musician, to make it simple as that. Because for me, I look at accounting and it makes my head hurt because it's just not the way I'm built. But I can look at something in the creative space, in the more esoteric areas of life, meaning marketing and concepts and things like that, which are more of the creative side, and I flourish in that world. It took me a long time to figure that out. But in school, so many times they jam you in the other way, and you just can't find yourself. But it's interesting that you're able to now identify a gene sequence that can say, oh, this person, I can't tell you he's going to be a musician or she's going to be a musician or a writer, but she definitely has the abilities that are leaning towards the creative side. Right.
And so the best tests for students generally, but they don't know what they want to do when they grow up, is a vocational inventory that matches their personality characteristics to people who are happy in those jobs. So you start doing some kind of job because you were kind of pushed into that, and then you start doing it and say, this sucks. Well, it's because it's not matching who you are. Well, what does match it? Well, you take this inventory and you find out that, people who have your personality are really happy doing this kind of job. And what you hope it is that your personality would be best suited for manual labor. You should be digging ditches. Well, maybe people don't want to hear that, but on the other hand, somebody who likes that, like heavy physical work outside, they feel good about it. Yeah, they'd say, okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So when I took that test in graduate school, because I didn't know what I wanted to do, it came out with 3 things. The first one was policeman, which I never thought of before. And then I think, why in the world do I match a happy policeman? Well, I'm interested in social justice and things like that, and like societal order is important to me. The second was priest. I'm not a religious person at all, and I thought, well, why was that matched? Well, okay, I'm concerned about things like compassion and empathy, and so I can see that would kind of fit. The third was social scientist. And I thought, oh, okay, that makes sense, because I kind of like the science side. I like how studying how people are and interactions among people and all that stuff. And it brings in elements of the other 2 things too. So it was around that time that I switched after I got my master's degree, to get a doctorate in psychology. And it turns out, I kind of like this. I can see how that inventory, the personality that I have, fits into somebody who would be happy in that profession. So those tests are pretty good.
Well, the and being a scientist is almost like being a priest, but just different texts that you study constantly in many ways.
Yeah, and even on the police side, part of policing is about skepticism. right? I mean, a policeman
Absolutely.
has to learn pretty quickly to be very skeptical about everybody because they're always watching. Well, that's true in science too. You know, you're never quite sure you're doing this right, and you know, you're forced to be evaluating and judgmental almost, especially when you're a referee for papers. You know, what you're looking for is what's wrong with this. That's usually the way it goes. Something's wrong with this, and then you have to figure out why. I'm not sure that policemen do that, but I bet that there is an element in there saying, well, that person looks suspicious. Why did they look suspicious? Well, they learned things to look for. Well, so I've learned things to look for too.
Now, where can people find out more about your work and purchase some of your books?
Well, they can go to deanradin.com, which is my personal site, or they can go to noetic.org, noetic.org, which is where I work, the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And we have a science team, which is all of us working together on various kinds of projects, and we call it an experiential team, which tries to take the kinds of things that we're learning about and turning it into programs and workshops and materials for people to learn about it without having to do the science.
Dean, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a fascinating conversation with you, as I knew it would be. So I appreciate you coming on the show and the work that you're doing. And hopefully the things you're talking about now will be just the norm in hopefully not 100 years, maybe a little bit sooner. But I appreciate you, my friend.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching.
Let's speak about interpretation and interpretational choices that we have in this piece. So what is quite important, in my opinion, is to notice the difference between mezza voce, that is being written in the beginning of the score, and sotto voce, that is being written in the second section, in the bar number 25. So the basic difference between these two is that mezzo voce is played, it means that we have to play quite softly, but with a good projection of the voice. But nevertheless, it's an embodied sound. It should sound quite deep. While sotto voce, this is kind of a whisper, so we really have to play very, very softly. That's why traditionally, for Chopin, when we see mezzo voce, traditionally is being played without the left pedal, and sotto voce is being played with the left pedal. That's why when very, very softly. That's why traditionally for Chopin, when we see mezzo voce, traditionally is being played without the left pedal, and sotto voce is being played with the left pedal. That's why in the beginning we are searching for the deep sound, but nevertheless the sound that gives us this sense of a huge space, of a huge depth, because the distance between hands is tremendous. And actually this is interesting, that this nocturne, it doesn't really have any slightest touch of sentimentality and amusement that might still be felt in many other nocturnes of Frédéric Chopin, but this piece rather corresponds to his later highly dramatic and anti-sentimental pieces like Fourth Ballade, Polonaise Fantasy, and some others, works that are so profound and absolutely don't have these qualities of a salon music that might be composed just for amusement, just for entertainment of a cultured society. This work is a very tragic and very dramatic one. That's why we might want to avoid any sentimentality and any sweetness in this piece. That's why from the very beginning, of course, this support on the left hand that I was speaking about in the previous lesson is very important in order to achieve that deep, soft but firm touch. And of course it's very important to phrase this music properly. So at the very beginning we have to move through the whole phrase, which is 4 bars long. For that, we shape this phrase dynamically. So intensifying to A flat. Then this syncopated rhythm that appears in the second bar, I would play this syncope almost kind of earlier than it's supposed to be, because if we would play it exactly on time, 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and 1 and 2, and it sounds a bit formal, it sounds like conventional, and we want it to sound tense and we want it to sound special. So bum 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 bum. In these melodies, of course, we would shape them following the direction of movement. So when melody goes down, play softer diminuendo towards D, and then crescendo toward the higher part of the motif. So basically, in this piece, we just follow the logic of the melody. When the melody goes up, we make a slight crescendo. When the melody goes down, we make a slight diminuendo. And of course, regarding tempo, this part is fairly slow. But in order to feel it as a flow, and in order to feel it, in long phrases, in order not to sound vertical, like not to sound static, we have to feel this music almost in tune, so almost alla breve. Although it's written in 4 beats, but try to feel it almost as alla breve, like 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. Because if you would feel that in 4, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. It sounds immediately more steady and much less vibrant and much less in a flow. But that's a small tip. In order to make it moving, in order to make it flow, despite this slow tempo, in order to play all these 16 notes that are plenty here, in order to make them sound vibrant and tense, we should feel the pulsation of 16th notes. It means that I feel that bum 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 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, and also it's a huge topic actually about these dotted rhythms, because we can affect the character of the piece tremendously just adjusting this dotted rhythm just a tiny bit, because if you would play that faster, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, it gives this kind of playful feeling to the music. But if I would stretch it a little bit, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, it makes the music more persistent, more dramatic, and more tense. Of course, we have to be very delicate in choosing how exactly we want it to sound, and I spend a lot of time playing around with such things in order to refine my interpretation, but just in order to find your way how to pronounce these dotted rhythms, just don't forget to feel that pulsation of 16th notes. And then there's a suggestion of crescendo toward the end of the phrase, which might actually work if you would would resist making crescendo before. So
video の声が小林の